Hello, and welcome back to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, How America Culture Came to Be, the podcast of the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rachel. Today being April Fool's Day, we thought we'd celebrate a little by talking about hoaxes in history or pranks that were so notorious they've gone down in history. We're talking about War of the Worlds level of misbelief on some of these. But first, Alex, I have to ask, have you ever played a prank on a sibling, coworker, kids, what have you?
Generally, yes, they never work because no one ever believes me. But once when I was 15, on April 1st, I went with my mom shopping somewhere and I moved the car when she was shopping just to convince her. And she figured out that I moved the car and was mad because I was 15 and I had no business moving the car in the parking lot. So it didn't work. My funniest April Fool's joke, which I didn't do, was when I worked at Old Sturbridge Village. Someone put a color TV in one of the houses, and none of the curators figured it out, and it was there all day. And I thought that was hysterical.
All right, so, well, props to you for thinking about moving the car, or were you just feeling like testing the waters there about actually driving?
I think I just wanted to drive.
So, as Alex just exemplified, it's human nature to seek out the funny, the absurd, and often that comes at the expense of someone else's dignity or sanity. But how did April Fool's Day come to be? That one's relatively unknown. There's some discussion as to it may have been a Roman feast of fools, but more scholars lean toward the change in the calendar in 1564. Previously under the Julian calendar, the new year was in spring around the vernal equinox. With the new start of the year now abruptly being January 1st, it seems some rural villages didn't get the memo. These villagers continued celebrating New Year toward the end of March, and this was, of course, ripe fodder for mocking from the more sophisticated urbanites. Thus, some tradition of mocking or fooling possibly came about at the start of April. Not that anyone really needed an excuse for a special day devoted to mocking others.
Common medieval pranks were sending people off on so-called fool's errands. Yet that is where that term originates. People would try to convince their friends and neighbors to find impossible objects like a bucket of steam or a bucket of striped paint or a jar of elbow grease. One of the earliest medieval pranks, or really series of pranks, were the shenanigans of a monk in the 15th century. Thomas Betson of Sion Abbey seems to have a liking for making people look twice. He was recorded as having hollowed out an apple core and placed a beetle inside so the seemingly intact apple would rock back and forth. He was also known for suspending an egg in midair using hair and wax. That must have been some very blonde hair to be invisible.
One of the first hoaxes to be directly set on April Fool's Day was the infamous Washing of the Lions Day at the Tower of London in 1698. People showed up in droves for an event that never actually took place. Prank accomplished, but the real genius of this one was that it lasted into the 19th century with people spreading the imaginary event by word of mouth, so every year people showed up to see it. Certain enterprising folk even started selling tickets to capitalize on the fame of the illusory event.
Jonathan Swift, the noted satirist, was not unexpectedly a fan of April Fools. He detailed a journey to Stella indicates he liked elaborate design and planned out hoaxes for the 1st of April. His prank in 1708 was definitely not spur of the moment. In January 1708, Swift published predictions for the year 1708 by an alias called Isaac Bickerstaff. This was a mock of a noted almanac maker and astrologer, John Partridge. In Swift's predictions, he predicted Partridge would die around March 29th. He then published being an account on the death of Mr. Partridge, the almanac maker, upon the 29th instant. In a letter to a person of honor written in the year 1708, which was supposedly written anonymously by a person, quote, employed by the revenue, unquote, in it, the supposed author details visits leading up to the announced death of Partridge, particularly that the gentleman in question repudiated all almanac makers and astrologists as quacks. Quote, for, said he, I am thoroughly persuaded and think that I have a very good reason that Mr. Bickerstaff spoke altogether by guess and knew no more that will happen this year than I did myself, unquote. Not only did this fictitious account undermine Partridge's credibility, but Londoners actually believed the story of Partridge's death, and mourners and funeral workers showed up outside his home at all hours, disturbing him. There was a lot of back and forth of publishing between Swift's aliases and Partridge about it. If he was alive or dead, that added to the general confusion. When he went outside, people who recognized him poked fun at him by asking how his widow was coping with his death. Swith had to have delight in the reaction to his prank, especially when Partridge didn't publish another fraudulent almanac for a number of years after his state of life was established. This hoax was definitely not long forgotten, as it inspired a very similar plot from none other than Benjamin Franklin himself. Using his person for his Poor Richard's Almanac, Franklin predicted the death of a rival almanac maker, Titan Leeds, for October of 1733. Needless to say, Leeds didn't die and was very upset, making accusations against Poor Richard in his own almanac. Franklin must have really enjoyed the reaction because he continued to print that Leeds was actually dead and that there must be a series of men claiming to use his name for print. He continued this until 1738 when Leeds did actually die. Franklin's response as Poor Richard to congratulate the pretenders on finally ending their hoax.
A fairly amusing and again long lasting prank was the so called discovery of a 16th century newspaper called the English Mercury, which made it the oldest newspaper in the world. Thomas Birch, a noted historian, generously donated the newspapers with a lot of other papers and research to the British Museum in 1766. They were rediscovered in 1794 by a researcher, George Chalmers, who got overly excited and bought the prank papers hook, line, and sinker. He was researching the history of newspapers as a medium, so this must have seemed like quite the windfall. Unfortunately, these were fakes. In 1744, Philip York, the second Earl of Hardwicke, and Thomas Birch created issues of what appeared to be a legitimate newspaper as part of an intellectual challenge among their friends. Being prepared by a historian and a very well-educated peer of the realm, the 3 editions of the English Mercury were made exactly in the styles of the earliest papers. The topics largely focused on the impending Spanish Armada, which gave information from a reputably low official source. Scholars used the articles as references for decades. It wasn't until 1839 that the paper was found to have been made over a century after the events described, and the handwriting on the manuscript was identified as York and Birch's, thus the hoax was revealed. Now that one's playing the long game. Even today, the English Mercury is cited by unwary scholars. The BBC and the National Library of Australia both include the English Mercury as sources without a hint that it was a hoax.
Back to Ben Franklin for a moment. On one of his most abiding and widespread pranks was the speech of Miss Parley Baker. This was an article about a trial in New England that was picked up and published in London in 1747. Magazines and other newspapers picked it up weeks and spread it throughout the British Isles and even back to the colonies. The bulk of the article was a printing of the defendant's passionate speech. Polly Baker was a young woman on trial for having a child out of wedlock. For the 5th time, her speech was moving plea to consider the unfairness of public and legal persecuting the women involved. It was a crafty social and legal argument that brought a contrast between a religious fault and a legal one, especially as Polly had at least added to the population without creating a burden on either another person, i.e., the fathers, or the state, while men do otherwise. Her speech was so moving, the article said, that one of the magistrates was compelled to propose marriage to her. The argument about fairness under the law was picked up and created a public debate. Did it do much to laws at the time? No. But the article in the public consciousness and continue being recorded in books documenting the colonies and pushing for social and legal revolutions. One, for example, was Social Bliss Considered, written by London author and deitist Peter Annett in 1749. Now, these accounts, third-hand as they were, also give a hefty dose of reconfiguring to make Polly's argument about equality between the sexes. Why should the mother and not the father of the illegitimate child be persecuted? This, of course, was meant to fit into the broader social critique of those authors. But what does this have to do with Benjamin Franklin? He was the one who actually wrote the supposed account of the trial. How do we know? Well, both Jefferson and John Adams mentioned it in documents. Adams mentions it twice as a Franklin production, once in 1778 and again in 1783, as one of Franklin's outrages to morality and decorum. In a letter to James Warren, Jefferson recorded in 1818 as having heard it from Franklin himself in 1784. Even Franklin's son admitted it was perpetrated by his father. Given the social stir it caused, the speech of Miss Polly Baker was right up Franklin's alley for public hoaxes. Here's one that should have made people doubt its possibility, but instead proved how gullible people can be. In January 1749, an ad was printed in London's newspaper, quote, "At the new theatre in the Haymarket on Market next the 16th instant, it is to be seen a person who performs the several most surprising things following. First, he takes a common walking cane from any of the spectators and thereupon plays the music of every instrument now in use and likewise sings to surprising perfection. Second, he presents you with a common wine bottle which any of the spectators may first examine. This bottle is placed on the table in the middle of the stage, and he, without any equivocation, goes into it in the sight of all the spectators and sings in it. During his stay in the bottle, any person may handle it and see plainly that it does not exceed a common tavern bottle. Those on the stage or in the boxes may come in masks, habits, if agreeable to them, and the performer, if desired, will inform them who they are." Unquote. You can imagine what happened next. After a week of talk and rising interest among Londoners, the theater was packed to standing room only. Everyone was excited to see the wonders that had been touted in the advertisement, but nothing happened. The Ipswich Journal reported the next day that, quote, "Without so much as a single fiddle to keep the audience in good humor, many grew impatient. Immediately followed a chorus of catcalls heightened by loud vociferations and beatings with sticks," unquote. The audience grew ugly and turned into a mob. They ripped up the theater and even threw a little candle on stage. Of course, in a totally unforeseen turn of events, the box office receipts were also destroyed, meaning the mob couldn't get a refund. No one truly knows who perpetrated the hoax, but the forerunners are probably the Duke of Portland and the Earl of Chesterfield, as the Duke had bet the Earl that he can find, quote, "enough fuels in London to fill a playhouse," unquote. Regardless of the newspapers had a field day with similarly fake ads running continuously for the next few weeks, poking fun at the incredulous crowd.
In a rare instance of a hoax that was not actually a hoax, may we present the case of the duck-billed platypus. As an Australian mammal, it was definitely not a critter English biologists were familiar with. There had been many hoax specimens of so-called mermaids and other fantastical ideas, whether they were meant to be a legitimate attempt at trying to make sense of skeletal remains, see the 1663 idea of a unicorn, or an actual hoax of sewing together various pieces of various animals. When the governor of New South Wales sent a pelt and a rendering of this new animal in 1798 to George Shaw, the keeper of the Department of Natural History at the British Museum, Shaw had his doubts. He wrote an article detailing the new animal, which he dubbed Platypus anatinus, or the flatfoot duck. However, he did hedge his bets and included his doubts in the article. He wrote it was, quote, "impossible not to entertain some doubts as to the genuine nature of the animal, and to surmise that there may have been practiced some arts of deception in its structure," unquote. The fact that a mammal was aquatic, had a bill, laid eggs, and produced venom was a bit much to swallow for many in the period. Zoologist Robert Knox was so convinced that because the specimen had come from the region of the Indian Ocean where many Chinese sailors had played hoaxes with animals before, the platypus was fake, that he talked Shaw into shaving the pelt to look for stitches. Knox wrote, quote, "aware of the monstrous impostures which the artful Chinese had so frequently practiced on European adventurers, the scientific felt inclined to class this rare production of nature with Eastern mermaids and other works of art," unquote. Scientists continued to debate the topic for nearly a century.
Here's an entry recorded in William Hone's 1830 Everyday Book, French Hoaxin, July 1817. A man, a posing figure wearing a large sabre and immense mustachios, arrived at one of the principal inns of a provincial city, with a female of agreeable shape and enchanting mien. He aligned at the moment that dinner was serving up at the table. At his martial appearance, all the guests rose with respect. They felt assured that it must be a lieutenant general or a major general at least. A new governor was expected in the province about this time, and everyone believed that it was he who had arrived incognito. The officer or gendarmerie gave him the place of honor. The comptroller of the customs and the receiver of taxes sat by the side of the madame and exerted their wit and gallantry to the utmost. All the titbits, all the most exquisite wines were placed before the fortunate couple. At length the party broke up, and everyone ran to report through the city that Monsieur the Governor had arrived. But oh, was their surprise when the next day His Excellence, clad in a scarlet coat, and his august companion, dressed out in a gown glittering with tinsel, mounted in a small open calash, and preceded by some musicians, went about the squares and public ways selling Swiss tea and balm of Mecca. Imagine the fury of the guests. They complained to the mayor and demanded that the audacious quack should be compelled to lay aside the characteristic marks of the brave. The prudent magistrate assembled the common council, and those respected persons, after a long deliberation, considered that nothing in the charter forbade the citizens to let their beard grow on their upper lip, dismissed the complaint altogether. The same evening, the supposed governor gave a serenade to the complaints, and the next day took his leave, and continued his journey amidst the acclamations of the populace, who in small as well as in great cities are very apt to become passionately fond of charlatans. The fact is that it was still talked about enough in 1830 to have been collected by Horn, and his research speaks volume for the impact a prank can have on its victims.
In 1835, the New York Sun caused a bit of a stir when it published a series of 6 articles about life on the moon. Quote, "We will state at once that by means of a telescope of vast dimensions and an entirely new principle, the younger Herschel at his observatory in the southern hemisphere has already made the most extraordinary discoveries in every planet of our solar system, has obtained a distinct view of objects in the moon fully equal to that which the naked eye commands of terrestrial objects at the distance of 100 yards, and has affirmatively settled the question of whether this satellite be inhabited and by what order of beings." The articles were actually the invention of a newly arrived staff writer who was seeking to increase the sales of the Sun, since the paper had fallen behind competitively. Why did he choose to focus on the moon? Well, that was timely, given that the running debate among astronomers, amateur and professional, about the ability of the moon to support life. You'd think more people would be suspicious of bat-winged human-like figures and lots of colorful flora on the moon, but a large portion of the population believed the stories, much to figures like Edgar Allan Poe's disgust. Eventually, people realized it was a hoax, but nobody learned their lesson. War of the Worlds pulled nearly the same hoax on its first radio broadcast just over a century later.
This one is fascinating. So in 1869, a stone figure of a giant man was pulled out of the ground in Cardiff, New York. People paid 50 cents a person to come look at what some people considered a petrified human giant and others said was simply a statue. Yep, the stone giant was actually a long-running hoax perpetuated by George Hull. He spent about $3,000, which in 1869 equated to about $70,000 today, had the statue carved from gypsum, modeled for himself, even aged it with sulfuric acid and pitted via pins, and then had it buried a year before it was, quote, found, unquote. That's a lot of work to prove a point in an argument, since the impetus for this whole thing was an argument atheist Hull had with a preacher about the literal meaning of giant in the Bible. With all the interest, the farmers whose land it was found on, and Hull, his silent partner, managed to sell the giant for $30,000. The game was up when a paleontologist, O.C. Marsh, got to examine it and determined its lack of antiquity. There was so much fuss about it that P.T. Barnum even bid to buy the Cardiff giant. Failing that, he basically just made a copy and drummed up even more attendance on his fake than the original fake. After that, the original sculptor sold replicas, so there were multiple giants roaming around the country. Hull confessed to creating the giant in December of the same year, but he already had made a lot of money from his curious onlookers. All that effort he went to was easily repaid by the audience, who went either from idle curiosity, belief, or contrariness. So we hope you enjoyed this look into famous hoaxes of history. It was very interesting researching the multiple ways people have played pranks or gone to the extreme efforts to convince a gullible public.
If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds wherever you get your podcasts. We bring you historical episodes twice a month. And if you're in the area, be sure to check out Wool Week. Happening this week, we'll be shearing our sheep by hand and demonstrating other historical fiber arts. Hope to see you soon.